Welcome to what is actually the 10th year for the annual British Debate Program at Prince George's Community College, and welcome to the TV studio of Prince George's Community College. My name is Marlene Cohen. I'm a professor of communication and theater and also coordinator of the International Education Center here at the college, and I'm delighted to do this program each fall with the sponsorship of the International Education Center, the Department of Communication and Theater, and the Honor Society of the college. This tour every fall shows a nice collaboration between Great Britain and the United States, in which two students from Great Britain travel through the United States debating. It is sponsored by the English-Speaking Union of Great Britain and the National Communication Association of the United States. Today you're going to see a debate in Lincoln-Douglas format, one against one, which allows each person to present and then to defend his or her position. Currently, we've been watching debates in this country, and this debate will be a little bit different from the presidential and vice presidential debates that we've eagerly watched this fall. One of the ways it will be different is that the speakers will actually stay on topic, right? Right, you are going to do that, aren't you, right? Another is that they will keep to time. Following the debate, for the live audience, we will have an audience vote. I will ask you which side you support at the end. And when you vote, you should vote on which side did the better arguments, did the better job of debating, not which side you agree with. So you really should put your own position to the side to make that decision. This year, I'm very honored to welcome to the United States and to Prince George's Community College, Eddie Bailey King and Willard Foxton. The presenters have offered to introduce themselves, each other, which I think would be wonderful. So let me introduce Eddie and Willard to you.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's lovely to have such a wonderful turnout, especially at this time in the morning when I'd usually be in bed. I'm just going to introduce Etty, and then Etty will introduce me. So Etty is 22 years old. She comes from London in England. She's a graduate of the University of Durham, which is a wonderful, hundreds of years old university. And it's very unusual in the university in that it has both a cathedral and a castle within it. Which is, you know, unusual amenities for any universities. I mean, most people are satisfied with a basketball court, but yeah, they have a cathedral. It's so beautiful inside that Harry Potter was filmed there. So if you've seen the Harry Potter movies, then you've seen where Etty went to university, although, as I understand it, the candles don't really float, although apparently they do have real ghosts, although you'd have to ask her about that. Etty graduated in English literature rather than witchcraft. And she took a first-class degree, which is exceedingly difficult. She's also won a number of international prizes for her understanding of literature and the quality of her undergraduate thesis. She's an expert on the way in which writing describes trauma and atrocity. Tying it, in terms of other prizes she's won, she was a Fulbright scholar. Last year, she went to Drexel University on that scholarship. Other than that, tying in with that theme of her undergraduate thesis in terms of atrocity and pain and trauma, Etty does a huge amount of volunteer work in the UK. So she's volunteered in some of the most difficult environments, not only in the UK but across the world. So within the UK, she's volunteered with and worked with ex-convicts, with sex workers, and she's worked with disadvantaged and underprivileged youth in the most difficult boroughs in London. And although you think, oh, the most difficult boroughs in London, well, it can't be that bad, it must be, you know, hooligans knocking over bins and things, we have exactly the same kind of problems of urban crime, deprivation and drug use that you see in the worst slums of Baltimore or New York. On top of that work, extremely noble work within the United Kingdom, Etty's also travelled all over the world doing aid work, and just before coming here, she was working, teaching in a leper colony in India. After she's hoping to go and start a master's program soon, once we get back to the United Kingdom, and then she wants to go on and teach English literature, but also maintain her relief work and write fiction.
Thank you so much. Okay, this is Willard Foxton. Willard is... Where do I begin? This is always fun. Willard comes from sorry. Willard comes from a tiny fishing village on the south coast of England called Hythe, famous for fish and other things. He attended a university in the west of England called Bristol. He studied law. He took a master's in international criminal justice. Can you still hear me if I face kinds of forward?
Yeah.
I'll try and balance the two.
Sorry.
No worries. I can even hold it. Masters in International Criminal Justice. He practiced as the equivalent of a public defender in the UK, which was extremely challenging work. And although Willard has a heart of gold and the ethics of the best of our lawyers, he eventually decided to move into journalism because he found it more rewarding, and he has a string of amazing journalistic achievements to his name. He made the signature BBC documentary on the Madoff scandal called The Madoff Hustle. He made a programme with Russell Brand called Russell Brand Addiction and Me about drug addiction and how to treat it in the UK. He was embedded in the winter of 2010 in Wakhan province in Afghanistan with the US Marines, and he's also covered the Israel-Lebanon war on the ground and piracy in the Nigerian river deltas. He is a brave man, in case you couldn't tell based on this, but he's also agreed to travel for a long period with me, so even braver. He now spends his time writing for a number of print newspapers, such as The Telegraph, which is a very famous newspaper in the UK, and he continues to produce lots of fascinating documentaries. Thank you.
Let's welcome them. All right, our topic for this morning is this House believes that it is a priority of government to promote justice and social good. Speaking in favor of the proposition will be Eddie Bailey King. Speaking in opposition to the proposition will be Willard Foxton. And they will each get an 8-minute constructive speech, 3 minutes in which to question each other in cross-examination, and a follow-up 3-minute rebuttal speech to build their arguments. And we look forward to this debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for showing up at this painfully early hour. And thank you to all of the staff here at Prince George's, to our amazing host Marlene, and to all of you, staff and students included, who've put in the hard work to allow us to come here and talk to you about justice and social good. Woo! Okay, so what am I going to talk to you about today? Right, on the topic of justice and social good, I'm going to talk to you about why government is empowered to look after our societal rights, and how that's more important than abstract liberties or, rights that just seem to exist out in the ether. I'm going to say it matters more what happens on the ground to real people. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why government is uniquely able to act in a way that charities and third parties just cannot hope to help, and why we have to put our faith in government. And thirdly, I'm going to ask what happens without the state, and what happens when we roll back the protective boundaries of government. I'm going to tell you that living in the Wild West with cowboys probably isn't as fun as it looks in the movies, and we should be kind of grateful that we have a government that can look after us. So firstly, a little bit of a definition about what I mean by justice and social good, because that's quite a nebulous term. But in essence, I'm going to say that what that comes down to is a sort of general belief in the value of looking after individual welfare, and saying that the kind of metric we have here is that on the one hand, we could say, yeah, liberty is great and individuals could live in a total state of nature and we could do nothing to stop them from acting. But what I'm going to argue is that we have to look to a different metric, which is that people matter more than abstract principles, and that if people are suffering medically or suffering from racism or sexism, or are being told, being put down by the people around them, and the state isn't able to protect them from these hateful practices, then that's when we need to step in, and that's better than the abstract principle of liberty. So what's that about? It's about equality of opportunity. It's about saying things like, just because you happen to be born in a very underprivileged slum, that doesn't mean that you should be condemned to live in those conditions forever. It doesn't mean that just because I happen to be born be born a woman, that people are allowed to tell me that I don't have the right to do what I want. So it's things like having a public school system that is bound by rules and cannot tell me that because I'm a woman I shouldn't go to college. It's things like having a health system that will intervene when a child is being abused or when somebody is suffering, outrageous practices. Just because female genital mutilation might be a practice in some communities, we want a health system that steps in and says, no, that's not okay. Your welfare is being harmed. And what it's also about is the lottery of birth. Because I don't think any of us in this room would say that we were born where we were born purely because we deserved to be. The rich in our society are lucky. They're very, very lucky. And because they are born into these privileged positions, they have a duty to help people less fortunate than them. And the government is the mechanism that we use for doing that, to counteract for the outrageous unluckiness of where some of us happen to be born, because that shouldn't dictate where we go in the future. And it's also about economic sense, because a society that has a safety net, that fishes out people from the very bottom of society, is the one that doesn't waste talent. It's the one that finds the most talented musicians or future academics or athletes and doesn't allow them to just slip down to where the circumstances of their birth have put them. So in essence, we're saying that, liberty is cool. I'm not going to argue against that. I'm in America after all. But what it matters more about is welfare. So firstly, why is government empowered to do this? Right. Well, we elect our representatives. And why do we do that? We don't do that just because it's fun, although I imagine it is thrilling, to cast a vote on a ballot. And it's not about the idea that we can just draw a link between who we are and who our representatives are, and then they can do whatever they like for us. They act in our name. And when we give them a mandate, we give them a mandate to represent us as a community. I don't cast a vote purely as one individual to have the president of the USA represent me as a private person. I act for my entire community, and I act for my country when I do that. So government, we think, is empowered to set a wider standard for codes of practice. And yeah, that might be more than a little bit difficult. It's difficult to say what a society on the whole values. People in Texas may think that their right to carry a gun triumphs my right to access free education. It's possible that people anywhere will hold values that are totally in opposition to mine. But in essence, we try and set an objective standard because that's what we do as a global community. We have laws about what constitutes, an international crime of war. We have laws as to what constitutes a human right. And we say that it doesn't matter if I'm born in the slums of India or the slums of Western Europe or the slums of North America. I have the same central rights, and it's difficult to categorize them, but they still exist. Now, we also think government is empowered to step in and provide me things like a police system that will look after me, a healthcare system that will look out for me when the people around me aren't doing that. But it also is balanced by the fact that we have loads of other checks. So we have the media, who when they see something that isn't going down quite as it should, they can step up and they can tell the entire world that that's not okay. So that's why government is, a friend to all of us, because it's not acting just totally without restrictions. We can actually step up and criticize it. And also we educate our citizens because we say you need to have the wisdom to know whether your government is treating you right. And it's a two-way exchange. So on to why the government is able to act. It's a collective action problem. If I wanted to set up my own army to protect the entire USA, I would struggle to do so. Likewise, if there were 5 of me or 10 of me or 20 of me who agreed. It's only possible to act all as a massive group. And that's because there are incentives to allow us to do that. There are governments to sort of act as a check on me if I try and set up my private militia. And, people don't like that. There's nothing really to stop me doing that. If the government do that, we vote them out and we get very angry about doing so. So it's the safest way. The government has access to way more information than any of us. It can access federal records, it can access surveys and statistics and find out what's going on in the ground. And no charity, however well-meaning, really has the resources to do that because no one can compete with the amount of information and access that the government has. It can monitor what's going on and it can punish people when they don't look after my individual rights. When my teacher in my classroom tries to ignore my right to access college education and says, no, you don't deserve that, the government can say, well, no, that's not what you should be doing as a teacher. You're an agent of the state. You need to be safeguarding general welfare. Now, we also think the government has way more reach than any other small organisation. So you can have public health campaigns that educate loads of people, and you can have things like widespread vaccination programmes that only work if you get pretty much everyone into them. And it's just not something that the individual can do. So we think that the government can and it should act. Now on to justice, because where's the justice in a purely libertarian state? If we don't have any regulations to avoid people like us being exploited, then goodbye clean air and goodbye clean water, because the incentives that are on big business are just to maximise profit, and no good business would ever stop to think about how individual people are being harmed, because that's not good business. Pure good business is paying a 13-year-old boy $1 a day to climb up a chimney and sweep it. It's 19th century stuff, it's antiquated, and we deserve better than that. We need government as a check on that. We need government playing the representative of every single citizen, because, as I say, we're not purely private individuals in a state of nature. We live in communities, we live in families, we live in the communities where we study, where we worship, where we all live together. And we need to act in recognition of that. Because lastly, what happens without the state in this kind of cowboy Wild West that I mentioned? Well, without the police or without legal aid, who do I have to turn to? If I can't represent myself because I can't afford to hire a really wealthy lawyer, then who's going to do that for me? Nobody. But the rich businessman who tries to take me to court, he can access everything. So it's all very well to talk about liberty in the abstract, but who has a choice when they're disenfranchised? If I'm poor and I can't afford to buy health insurance, people will try and tell me that that's my choice not to insure myself. It's not a choice if my hand was forced, and it matters most for the people who don't get to choose what services they access. If you're really rich and you don't like Medicaid, don't access it. That's fine. This is about protecting the people who don't have any choice otherwise about what happens to them. So for these reasons, I beg to propose. Thank you. Do I stay?
Etty, you talked a lot about how the government is composed of our elected representatives and it's our elected will. Is a vote for a party that disagrees with some of the things that you've talked about, like, for example, healthcare, therefore a completely invalid vote? Are some political views just totally unacceptable?
I don't think that any political view is totally unacceptable. We need to air even those views that we find distasteful. But what matters more is practical outcomes, and what matters more is looking to what will happen to the people on the ground. So if I privately believe that the government should do absolutely nothing and let me just move to Alaska with a shotgun and live in a hut, that's fine for me to believe that. But the more important thing is to look at the entire community and the entire country and see who's better off.
But the reason why people vote is because they want certain policies enacted or certain policies not enacted. So under your model, is basically the Republican Party completely illegal?
No, unfortunately not. Apologies. No, because you give the example there of an entire party, that all the swathes of the Republican Party has different ideas as to what constitutes individual liberty. It's not about one view being correct in the abstract and then you're allowed to vote for what's correct. It's about saying that we allow people to represent their political views, and that's fine, and we should allow them to come into Congress and House of Representatives because that's a talking shop for how we represent our views. But overall, the role of government is to look to welfare. So those people can be a part of our government, but they're not allowed to dictate what happens to absolutely all of us, because the people who get shut out are the weaker, if you will. If very, very rich people want to elect a government that will do absolutely nothing for them, let's have their voices in the system, but their voices are also getting heard in other places, and it's more important that we kind of substitute for the people who traditionally don't have much access to the political process because of where they live, because of how much money they have, because they have no historical background of getting a proper education, for instance. That's more important.
So is hearing their voices enough for being completely disenfranchised? Because they get to have their voices heard under your system, but they don't ever get to enact their policies.
Well, are you suggesting that the super, super wealthy are totally shut out of society? Under any model,
they would be.
I have to disagree, because if you're having your representatives entering into the political process on your behalf, and if you're still accessing all the other areas in which we make decision making, then you are not being shut out. Democracy is a game of compromises. Absolutely no one in the USA gets their perfect view represented. Nobody gets that in any democracy, however healthy and however functional. It's a game of, as I say, playing compromises between what we would perfectly like to see and what, we're okay with. It's about compromise.
In terms of the last point, in terms of what you talked about in terms of social justice and regulation, under your model where you have really strict regulations in the US, isn't that just exporting poverty to the third world? If you regulate hard here, then all you're doing is you're making sweatshops be in Indonesia or India or anywhere else in the world.
Firstly, there are still plenty of reasons why people choose to base their businesses in the US. Lower transport costs, local expertise, things like people value seeing that something was made local. We all value that. So there are still reasons why people would base in the US. Secondly, there are international treaties and regulations that attempt to stop exploitation of people in the third world. And thirdly, I might even go so far as to say that our duty is to citizens at home first. And that is tragic if people are being exploited in other countries. But we have no control over what their legal systems do. We can only hope to trade with them, chat to them, hope to export our democratic values, say, it'd be really nice if you stopped exploiting your people. That's the best we can do. So I'm actually going to put it out there and say that if some people suffer in other countries, we're okay with that because we value our citizens' welfare.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've got a very difficult task in front of me before you, or at least Etty would have you believe that. Because Etty would have you believe that what I'm arguing for is the Wild West, where everyone has a right to do whatever they like, whenever they like. Etty would have you believe that I'm standing up here, and because she's proposing doing things that she defines as good and just, I have to stand here and propose evil and injustice. And while I'm sure there are some places in America I could go and propose evil and injustice, and they'd be very happy, I think you're all very, very rational people. The truth is, ladies and gentlemen, every government on Earth, and every government that ever has been on Earth, thinks that it is good and it is just. If you look back at the Cold War, Moscow thought it was just. Washington thought it was just. Rome thought it was absolutely just when it expanded all across Europe and killed all of the barbarians. It thought what it was doing was good. It thought what it was doing was right. The problem with this whole idea is that everyone thinks they're doing the right thing. Governments which are legally elected stand there and they are elected by people. They're elected by groups. And what those groups want is important. The whole foundation of our state is based around the idea that if you get together in a political party and you have more than your voices heard, you get to have your views enacted. And that's something that Etty's proposal says, that there is one absolute good, there is one absolute just, and if you don't agree with that, then you can get out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a few examples of where, in the Western world, where decisions that were, quote, good and just have led to terrible consequences. Then I'm going to come on and I'm going to talk about the dangers of painting one side of an argument that's about right or wrong, as good and evil, and how that leads to political gridlock. And finally, I'm going to come on and I'm going to talk to you about the role of government and really ask, what is government there to do? Is it there to do this nebulous good, which Etty seems to define as French-style social liberal democracy? And I think there are many different forms of democracy, and you don't have to be French to be good and just. So let's take a look at France, which is basically where Etty wants us all to live. France banned Muslim women from wearing the burqa. It justified this under a notion of women's rights. It said, if you choose to wear the burqa, then you are limiting your own rights. This is a good thing. This is a just thing. And immediately, Muslims all across France rose up and said, no, this is not good. This is not just. This is our choice. We have a right to our religion. We have a right to dress the way we choose. Even if you believe that the rights of women are totally destroyed by wearing the burqa, then if that woman makes a choice, that is her exercising her rights. The truth is, ladies and gentlemen, in every situation, in every political decision, you choose different values. You take a value judgment and you go, this thing is important, but there will always be people that take the other view. If you look across the board at other policies, I mean, that's just one example from France, where, just to give you a really good example of the fact that these rights are always in tension. And there are losers from every policy. So if you have state-subsidized healthcare in the US, then there are huge numbers of people who lose out because of where they work or what they do. If you have, but equally, if you have people buying their own healthcare, there are huge numbers of people who lose out. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, Etty tries to tell you that the only good choice is healthcare. But there are good arguments for saying that you should buy your own healthcare. You should get to choose what goes in your plan, what goes out of your plan. You shouldn't have a bureaucrat in Washington telling you what's right for you. You should be respected as individual citizens and make your own decisions. Etty wants you to abrogate every right to the government. And I say, no, we can trust you as individuals. Also, there's a really big problem when you get to this situation where everyone within a political system agrees something is good and agrees something is just. Look at the US and the system of subsidised mortgages that existed under Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Everyone on all sides of the aisle agreed that was a good thing. People on the right thought it was good, it was creating a profit, it was allowing people to access the market. People on the left thought it was great because people who could never afford to own their own homes before suddenly could afford their own homes. The fact that the government got involved with that could have just happened in the market, right? That would have existed anyway. But the fact that the government got involved, and every government and state, all through every level of the legislature, was incentivizing that and telling people all over America, buy your own home. You don't need any collateral. You don't need a deposit. You don't need a job. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that took what would have been a disaster when everyone's mortgages went underwater and turned it into a national catastrophe. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that when you get government endorsement behind a state program, state programs fail all the time. And ladies and gentlemen, if there's no discussion, if no one is allowed to put the other view, if the other view is silenced, then that's terrible. The other truth about it, she said, oh, states can always do better than charities and NGOs. That's a total lie, ladies and gentlemen. If you look at homelessness charities, the state is absolutely abominable at all kinds of things. It's terrible at rehabilitating prisoners. It's terrible at getting people off the streets. And that's because a lot of people it's terrible at policing poor communities. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, the reason why is a lot of people don't trust the state. A lot of people are much more willing to open up to a church group, to a charity group. The success rates prove it. If you look at homeless charities in the UK, you're something like 10 times more likely to get off the streets if you deal with a charity than if you deal with the state. There's also a huge danger, ladies and gentlemen, in painting the other side of an argument as good, you as good, and the other side, therefore, by definition, because they disagree with you, are evil. Sadly, we live in the real world, not Harry Potter, okay? There is no, Mitt Romney isn't Lord Voldemort. He isn't evil. He just has a different view to Barack Obama. Having differing opinions isn't wrong, right? And painting things in those terms shuts down debate, stops compromise, and means that the government can't function. And anyone who looks 10 miles down the road to DC can see exactly what the consequences of saying, we are not right, you are not wrong, we are good and you are evil. It means that you can't deal with the other side, and that's a huge problem. This comes down fundamentally to the real question of this debate. What is the role of government? Etty says it's to protect people. Okay, it's to protect people from forces of the market. It's to do the French system. And we say, no, the role of government is to carry out the mandate it's elected to do. In election campaigns, politicians promise the possible, and people vote depending on which policies they want. And to rule out certain policies as evil or unjust when they are merely a different view is fundamentally wrong and fundamentally contrary to democracy. If you look at the USA, you guys have a 32% tax rate because you say, you know what, people should be able to spend their own money. In Britain, we have a 45% tax rate because we think lots of things within the state are very important. France, they have a 75% tax rate because they say all of your money has to go on people who aren't you because you can't be trusted to spend your own money. And in France, they still run a deficit. They still can't afford. Etty says, look at every project. If we do my policy, everyone will be lifted out of poverty. France, with a 75% tax rate, can't afford to do that. You can't just pour money on a slum and suddenly everybody is rich and everybody's going to college. All of these policies require deficits. You can have it now, but your children can't. And I say, more than just people being elected for their policies, government have a responsibility beyond the now. They have a responsibility to the future. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, is it moral to bankrupt a country in 10 years down the line to give people success now? And we say, no, it's not. Thank you very much.
Okay, you said that every government thinks that it's good and just, but it's just not possible to say, like, to locate moral values, and that we live in some kind of postmodern nightmare where nothing is good and nothing is bad. What about objective measures like infant mortality rate being either high or low, people either living or dying?
Well, the truth about it is it's all about priorities. You talked about like a police system. Well, if we put all of our money into a police system and we had a cop in every bank and a camera on every street, then people would be safer. But there's a limited pot of money, and the government is elected to decide how that money is spent. If, as a government, they are elected and they want to cut infant mortality, great. I don't like dead babies. Nobody likes dead babies. But if you are, for example, an African government and you have a choice between cutting infant mortality in the cities or purifying the drinking water for millions of people, that's a valid choice. Nobody chooses, loads of babies will die, brilliant. It's all about difficult choices with a limited amount of money, and I think that is the real decisions that go on in politics.
But you've presented a false dichotomy where you say because money is limited, you can't do any of these welfare programs. That's patently untrue.
No, it's not you can't do any of them, it's that you can't do all of them. And I'm not saying that because you can't do all of them, you shouldn't do any of them. What I'm saying about it is in an election, people are allowed to express their views. And saying, I don't want my taxes to go on more welfare, I don't want my taxes to go on more healthcare, I want lower taxes so I can buy my own healthcare, is a totally valid point of view. It's not evil, it's just different.
It may be a valid point of view, but if we look at the fact that people don't always know 100% what is best for them. For instance, I couldn't start a public health campaign for myself if I wanted to. I couldn't start a one-man army. The government is able to take my money and use it in a way that reflects my interests, which I couldn't do as one person. You said you know what's best for you. That's not always true. For instance, people aren't at the forefront of epidemiology and they don't know what diseases they're contracting. And you also don't know what the alternatives are as an individual because you need a wider perspective.
You see, a second ago, Etty said that governments are these all-powerful things and they can do everything and they can solve all their problems. But suddenly, individuals are completely powerless. And she's gone to the heart of one of the biggest problems with the state taking over every facet of normal life. The truth about it is people just assume when they see a problem, when they see a homeless guy on the street, well, I can't solve that. She talked about collective action problem. She is a living embodiment of it. You walk down the street and go, well, I can't solve that. The state has to solve that. No, it's not true. People set up charities all the time. You worked in a leper colony. You made a difference. You made a decision to help people, right? You can go out, you can set up a charity. If you care about homelessness, it's much more effective, in fact, to go out, set up a charity and build it up. Where do you think charities come from? The state doesn't set them up. People go out and try to make a difference. Relying on the state too much creates a world where absolutely everyone thinks every problem can be solved by the state and there's no individual responsibility and there's no desire to go out and do great things like set up charities.
So much paper. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a step back and let's calm down a little bit because I'm feeling rather stressed out by the picture that Willard just painted for you, particularly because he kept using words like crazy government. Right. I don't think it's my duty to defend the French model of 75% tax. I also don't think it's my duty to defend overzealous governments who want to get all up in your grill and do everything for you. That's not what I was talking about in my first speech. What it comes down to is saying that individuals have choices. Cool, but you don't have the choice to actively disadvantage other people. Some choices are okay, others, whilst valid to hold and whilst perfectly legitimate to believe, cannot be enacted. I don't want to live in a world where the fact that somebody's valid sexist beliefs allow me to be shut out of opportunity. And I don't want to live in a world where somebody's valid, privately held racist values which are inside their mind could come into effect in policy. That's not democracy, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so I'm going to bring this back to the middle ground, which is where I clearly situated this debate, because he gave you these crazy extremes. He told you that every government thinks that it's good and just, and therefore what every government does is inherently good and just. And what he ignored is that we recognise in international law that there is this tricky middle ground, and we can't concretely say that's good and that's evil, but we do every day try and negotiate that balance, and we do it subjectively, but we say like, you know what, this practice of like horribly mutilating female babies, that might not be good. And his like postmodern paradox where nothing is like inherently morally good or evil is just so wildly inaccurate. He gave us these examples of like the French banning the burqa, and I point you again to the metric which I gave you, which is that freedom is cool but not if it disadvantages other people. So I don't think I have to defend those kinds of practices. Now, at the centre of his argument seemed to be this idea that you know what's best for you. And whilst I like that in principle, it's not a sentence that's very revealing, because what's underneath what he's just told you? He's told you that because you are a proud individual who knows their own life and knows what they want and knows how they want their future to, you know, to turn out in their own life, that means that you also know how to get there. And that is not the same thing, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm going to tell you that if it involves like a small compromise of your abstract value, that all people should pay 0% tax, that's not going to get you where you want either. I think, as ever, Obama said it better when he said, you didn't build that. Like, I didn't build the roads that got me here today, and I didn't build the school where I got my free public education, and I didn't build the college that took me in on a scholarship. And none of that is entirely mine in the sense in which my private values are entirely mine. If we're going to live in communities and expect to have infrastructure and sewers and have like a public hospital where I can go if I get shot in the head, then I think we have to make some compromises. And I don't think that's unreasonable. If it's a balance between this abstract idea that I know what's best for me and the fact that I didn't know what was best for me when I accidentally caught typhus from unpurified water, again, I'm going to take that loss on my liberty. Now, he also said that like when the government endorses stuff and it goes wrong, it's terrible. For instance, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Fine, sometimes the government gets things wrong. I don't think that is a controversial statement. He also said, you know, people don't just trust the state, and that's why programs don't work, and that's why the homeless can never be helped by the state. Maybe it's not perfect, but if the government is going to try and solve something, and I'm going to try and solve something privately, we can both attempt to do that, and that is fine. We can coexist, we can have charities alongside the state, we can have the third sector alongside the public sector, but we shouldn't rule either one of those out just because it doesn't suit Willard's vision of a universe in which nothing is good and nothing is evil, and it's all a postmodern moral paradox. I think I know what's good, and it's babies not dying, ladies and gentlemen, for which reason I beg to propose.
Ladies and gentlemen, Etty's tried to come up here again and tried to tell you that what I want is a 0% tax rate where everyone drives around in cars with an open can of beer in one hand and an assault rifle in the other. And the truth is, that's not what I want. What I want is a situation where if you go into Congress and you say, I want to be able to drink out of an open container and fire an assault rifle out of my car, you can say that, and if 51% of the population agree with you, brilliant, do it. And you can do it because we're in a democracy, and that's what democracy means. We say, ladies and gentlemen, her model offers you. It says, these views are valid to hold, they're legitimate to believe, right? But they're never legitimate as policies. And we say, no, that's not how democracy works. Democracy means that whoever wins the election gets to be president, right? They get to make decisions. And if they have promised during an election campaign to do things, they are allowed to do things because they won the election on the basis they would enact those policies. What Etty wants is a world where some policies are not enactable. But we're not talking about a 0% tax rate. We're talking about Mitt Romney wanting a 32% tax rate and Barack Obama wanting a 35% tax rate. These huge extremes that she brought up aren't realistic within politics. But where you do have a system which says certain things are are moral and are just, you do get injustices because the opposite side are painted as evil. She said, oh, well, our system where we only do good things, we only do just things, automatically won't be racist. And we say, well, no, that's not necessarily true. I gave you the example of France and the burqa. Governments do things that they think are just, that they think are good, that a substantial minority of the population thinks is completely wrong. And ladies and gentlemen, I think that's why you need an underpinning of rights to stop people from being ridden roughshod over. The problem with it is when you start imposing values on people, when you don't have a huge amount of control and you just say, well, we're going to do this. Your view doesn't matter. Your view about the burqa doesn't matter. Your view about taxation doesn't matter. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that's how rebellions start, because governments impose diktats, things they don't have a right to do. Now, ladies and gentlemen, finally, what it comes down to is Etty said, trust the government. And I say, trust yourselves. I think you have a much better idea of what is important for you than a state official, than a government official. She talked, ladies and gentlemen, and she said, she gave you this message of hopelessness that said, you can't make a difference. The only way you can make a difference is pay your taxes to Washington and hope they do what you want. I say no. I say if you think homelessness is a problem, don't just mail a check to Washington. Go out and deal with it. Thank you very much.
And the last people to speak this morning are you, the audience. I would like to have a show of hands for those of you who would vote. First we'll do in favor and then in opposition to the position. So those of you who would vote in favor of the position that it is a priority of government to promote social justice and social good, the position of Etty, please raise your hands. Somebody help me count. All right. Those of you who would vote in opposition to the proposition in favor of Willard. Are you voting twice? I'm afraid it's a draw. What do you think?
I think we're allowed to get. There's more hands. Can we do it one more time?
One more time. Those in favor? You. Pardon? I'm sorry. In favor of the proposition. Etty, one more time, please. All right, those opposed. In favor of Willard. Are you voting twice? There's so many hands.
A lot of people in the room.
There are. It's very close. I'm going to call it a draw, which I think is a sign of a very good debate. Thank you so much.